Great. So I'm just going to jump into the presentation for this evening. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm very happy that I was able to make it. I missed my first call because of a weather snafu on my end that had internet outage around the time in January when we were first trying to get together. So great to be here. Weather's a little bit better now in Ithaca, but still more winter-like than spring-like, sadly. All right, so Tim Laman and I'll introduce Tim here in just a second, but he and I have been working together on this thing we call the Birds of Paradise Project for quite a while now. We got to go way back to about 2004 is when Tim and I started working together. So we've been doing this for some time. And over the years of doing our work, documenting birds of paradise and sharing our discoveries and the research and the natural history of these fantastic birds with folks all around the country and the world, we often get asked a handful of questions time and time again. And it's great to know that even after our standard presentation, there were some things that we hadn't answered, and people cued in on that and asked those questions. And the two that come up frequently in the past, one was, are there any new bird of paradise species to be discovered? That was a common question. After we had tried to document all of the species in the wild, there was always someone who wanted to know if there was a possibility of yet another. And then another question that came up from our presentations a lot in the past is about bird of paradise conservation and the threats that they were facing. And that became kind of more and more of an urgent ask over the years. So tonight, I'm going to actually address both of those questions in a way that Tim and I haven't before, and also share with you some of the exciting and interesting things that I have shared in the past. So before I get any further, let me introduce Tim Laman, my good friend and sort of co-conspirator in all this work. Tim is a professional wildlife photographer and a field biologist by training and scientist, and we've been working on documenting birds of paradise, like I said, since about 2004. So whenever you hear me say we tonight, undoubtedly I'll slip in and talk about we, not just me. I'm talking about me and Tim usually, and nearly every photograph you will see tonight, including the one here behind me, is from Tim. So he is very much with us here tonight, in spirit at least, and in picture. All right, so I'm going to kick things off with a story about this wonderfully unusual and beautiful bird of paradise here. You might recognize this bird of paradise if you know anything about birds of paradise, and you might think, oh, it looks familiar. It looks like one of the most recognizable and famous birds of paradise of them all. Let's see here. There we go. You know the one that's the famous superb bird of paradise that transforms itself from a bird-like form to the bizarre psychedelic smiley face in the blink of an eye. You might have even seen this older video of ours on the internet before. If not, you might have seen it on Planet Earth or one of the other great documentaries out there in the past. So the superb bird of paradise is a widespread member of the bird of paradise family, and pretty much found in the mountain forests throughout all of New Guinea. So on this map here, everything that you see in dark green are the montane forests of New Guinea, and in pretty much all of the places on mainland New Guinea there, with a few exceptions, but for the most part, you could go into the forest at middle elevations in the cloud forest there, between 1,000 and 2,000 meters, and have a good chance of finding superb birds of paradise. But a few years ago, way over here in the far western part of New Guinea, in this big peninsula that's known as Bird's Head Peninsula or Vogelkop Peninsula, which is German for bird's head, in the far western part of New Guinea, we started noticing something was a little bit different about the superb birds of paradise there. If you'll notice on this map here, you can see the mountain range there, Arfak Mountains, and that's where I'm talking about for this little story here. So the first thing we had noticed on our work there, we've done many trips to these Arfak Mountains over the years, and we hadn't seen superb birds of paradise there for many of those trips, and we were kind of wondering where they were, because noticeably we didn't even hear them very often or at all in the early years. We didn't hear any superb birds of paradise. And so it wasn't until many years of traveling there that we finally did encounter them, and we realized right away, oh, well, the voice of the male of this population is substantially different, and that was kind of the first clue that something interesting was going on here. So instead of these harsh calls of the widespread form that we were very familiar with, not an uncommon sound in some of the right elevation forests throughout the montane forests of mainland New Guinea, this western population, it had this very more tonal whistle-like quality to their call, not that harsh sound. It was so different, like I mentioned before, we didn't even recognize that there was a superb bird of paradise in these forests. I think we had heard that, and it kind of struck me as, is that a bird of paradise sound? I don't even quite recognize that before I even put it together, that was coming from the superb in this forest. And so, of course, we already knew that the females looked different too. This was actually known from museum specimens. It was illustrated. So it wasn't entirely unknown that the Western population, had some uniqueness. And the Western population here on the left with the all black head, the more widespread form has geographic variation in the female plumage, but more or less, similar to the theme you see on the right there with the, white eyebrow and the brown running through the eye and the more white on the face and throat than the Western form. But the courtship behavior, the displays of the Western form had never been documented before, never been seen by Western scientists and ornithologists, I should say. Of course, local New Guineans who live in this area were very familiar with it, but birders and things hadn't encountered the displays of this species. And so this really intrigued us. And so after a while, we decided to do an expedition to try to film the courtship display of this population. And we made a series of expeditions into the remote part of the Arfak Mountains in West Papua, Indonesia, and tried to film the courtship behavior. And what we were looking for is very much like you see in the forest here. A fallen log is kind of the preferred display site for a male superb bird of paradise. And, kind of the mix is going through the forest, hearing a male calling from a very specific area frequently over the series of several mornings. And then you're looking for something that looks a lot like this. They will use branches up in the tree. Sometimes they'll even use a smaller tree or branch on the ground. But this is kind of the quintessential superb bird of paradise display site. And as you can see, this is an older log. It's been there for quite a while. So another view of that same log there, where Tim and I were working on another bird of paradise species nearby, Western Parodia. And sure enough, we started hearing that sound that we now knew was this superb from this population here, and tracked it down to this actual log. So that one there was truly a display site. We found a male sitting on it one day calling. We put out some GoPro cameras and let them run for a few hours while we did other things, came back and checked our camera traps, and sure enough, a male was visiting that log. So our next step was to try to build a photography blind and a scientific observation blind nearby where we could document the species. So you see that here, kind of made out of natural bush materials, several windows there because we were going to log long hours in there together. We wanted to, both be operating cameras and gather as many images and records of display as we could, because we weren't sure how often the bird was going to come. We've had a lot of frustrating times with this species in the widespread form of this species throughout New Guinea, where they're common, they're around, they call like crazy, but they tend not to come to their display sites when we are there to try to film them. Very frustrating at times. So we're using multiple cameras from one blind here, but we also were deploying a series of remotely controlled cameras. Like you can see, I have one here just outside the blind with a wide angle lens, but at various times we even had some connected more distantly at different angles all around that display log, with the idea that for every instance, and if a female were to come, we could gather records from multiple perspectives for a single event, and both document the behavior, get high quality imagery for filmmaking, and also for scientific purposes. So then we sat for days, weeks actually. We had to get up before dawn from our camp, and it was about a 45-minute hike from our camp to this site. We wanted to be there before the bird showed up, but we didn't want to disturb it in the morning, so we had to get in there before the dark. And so Tim and I spent many hours in this kind of blind, sitting side by side, just waiting and waiting, hearing bird around us, mostly incredibly boring, but filled with some moments of great excitement. And you can see Tim sort of manning the big photographic and video camera there. And, you know, even though it looks like I might be checking my email or surfing the web on the iPad there, in fact, that is just the controller for the remote camera. So it was a wireless system, and I was able to capture the images from the remote cameras using that iPad there. So what did we see when the male finally came for the first time and did a practice display? Well, what we saw really surprised us. It took us a minute to even kind of understand what we were seeing, but right away we realized, wow, this is different than what we've seen before in the other superb birds of paradise. When he lifted those specialized feathers up around his head there and around his body and presented it for a practice courtship display, we saw that the overall shape was considerably different. It had pointy tips and kind of a crescent shape, which was pretty different from the sort of oval or more oblong of the more widespread form. So here on the left is the western form from the Arfak Mountains, and on the right is something more representative of the widespread form. So the tips of this, you know, sort of crescent kind of point down and touch the log. You don't see that on the widespread form. And then the psychedelic smiley face, as we jokingly call it, from the widespread form, actually is kind of pointed down. The blue breast feathers are tilted down. It kind of looks like a grumpy face, not quite smiley, cousin of the widespread superb. But really what surprised us most was when the female arrived and the male did his display for the female. So what you can see is, as he's moving around the female in this sort of quick glide step, someone once said, wow, it almost looks like a wind-up toy kind of spinning around on the log there. It's just so smooth. And this is very different from the kind of up and down bouncing back and forth that has become the familiar display of the widespread form of the superb bird of paradise. So what do all these things add up to? Do they add up to this being a new bird of paradise species? Well, you know, between the voice and the known female plumage and these, you know, very differences in the courtship ornamentation as they are, especially as they're seen in the context of courtship display, you know, we really felt like, yes, this adds up to this Western population in the Bird's Head Peninsula being a distinct species within this group, within the genus Lophorina. And around the same time, it just so happened, completely independent of our work, there was another group of scientists working on the genetics from museum specimens, working on this genus Lophorina, as well as its close relatives, the riflebirds, and they had come to the same conclusion. So this population was known to be distinct. It even already had a subspecific name. So it's not really a discovery of an all new species that no one knew about before, of course, but that's how most new species are in ornithologies these days. It's a recognition of just how distinct the population is and becoming, elevated and given new status. And this one has stuck and is widely accepted now. The English name especially, has changed around a little bit. Some people call it Vogelkop lophorina now, because Vogelkop superb bird of paradise is quite a mouth. So eBird even is going with Vogelkop lophorina. But the main thing here is that, yes, after all these years, we really had some new discoveries in the field that led to this bird of paradise basically hiding under our noses all this time, and is now the fourth bird of paradise that's endemic to this mountain range, and is still the newest member of the bird of paradise family tree. And this really highlights just how much more there is to discover out there, and why Tim and I have been going to New Guinea for all these years, being away for extended periods of time, because there's just so much to be found and discovered. And that's been a big motivating principle in our work for all these years. So let me step back a minute, and now that we've had that little introductory story, and just talk a little bit about how we got to this point. Excuse me a second. A little horse. So I'm going to give you a very brief bird of paradise 101 and talk a little bit about the work that Tim and I had done together. So there are approximately 40 species of birds of paradise. When Tim and I did our work to over about a decade-long time to document all of the species in the family in the wild for the first time, we had a target of 39 species. That's what was known. So the new Vogelkop superb or Vogelkop lophorina clearly pushes that to 40. And I say about 40 species because, as a lot of you know, as birders, the science of taxonomy is never quite that clean, and the elevation of one population often has ramifications often on others. And so, as the systematics of birds of paradise are being worked out, there's probably a few more than 40 species now for most purposes, but you can think of about 40 species. So birds of paradise are mostly found in New Guinea. There are most of them are in mainland New Guinea. There are some species that are only found in a handful of neighboring islands. And there are 4 species found in Australia and only 2 that are found only in Australia. So by far, though, most of them are in mainland New Guinea. They are forest-dwelling, non-migratory, mostly fruit-eating, and they have a breeding system, a kind of lek polygynous breeding system that has led to the beauty and the extravagance and the courtship ornaments that really is the thing that draws most of us to birds of paradise. And what you see here in this image of these 39 species, these are the males of all of those species, and you can just see the great variety in color and shape and form that has evolved in this family of birds. So in 2012, Tim and I completed the effort to document them all for the first time. That's when this slide was made, and now we have to update it. So more recently, since we finished that kind of big work where we published our book and we had a museum exhibit and gave a bunch of talks about documenting all the birds of paradise for the first time, we kind of refocused our field efforts on revisiting a lot of the species that we had worked on in the past, some of them quite extensively, like this Western Parodia here. But over that time period, there had been, amazing technological advances in the camera equipment available, especially for documenting in low light, and remote cameras of smaller sizes to allow us to do things like I showed you with the superb bird of paradise, where we had, multiple angles to document the behavior. And this also allowed us to do things like document the courtship behavior from new perspectives that had never been seen before, kind of not the traditional view from the blind or like the way the bird watcher sees it. And that included trying to see these displays from the perspective of the female birds of paradise, because all of this ornamentation in the males has evolved as a way to attract the female as a potential mate. That's pretty much all male birds of paradise are about. And so looking at these displays outside of the way that the female birds of paradise sees them means we're not really seeing the full story. And we sort of headed down this path at the end of our period documenting them all. So we wrapped up the original documentation project in 2012, and in 2011, our last field season before we had completed documenting them all, we had experimented with our first multi-camera setup, which you're seeing a sketch here from Tim's field notebook, where we had remote cameras. At this time, they were tethered with forest Ethernet cables. This is before we had the wireless. And we had one up in a tree looking down, one off to the side, and then we had the blind, very much like you saw, with Tim manning the big camera and me at that time on a laptop, not an iPad. And we've refined our methods, and they're a little bit, more advanced, sophisticated with different cameras, but largely the same. And so what this allowed us to do, though, with the better photographic equipment, allowed us to, see the behavior of the Western Perodia from the perspective of the female in a way that we had only done with Wands's Perodia, one of the ones in Papua New Guinea back in 2011. So similar kind of work, much higher resolution, and able to see the ornamentation at the key moments of display. If you wait for it, boom, that key moment where the male flashes up his breast shield for the female, and he's got his iridescent feathers on the back of his head. And, if you weren't looking down from above, like the female's doing here on this perch above the male's display area on the ground, you just don't see that from the side. And that was a discovery that we had made with the other species of Perodia. And, now with this work, we were able to revisit species like this Western Perodia and see it with so much greater detail than we ever were originally. So much higher resolution, and this is like on a 4K, in some cases 8K, camera equipment, and there's so much more detail in what's going on down to the level of the individual feathers. And so, if you haven't seen the series on Netflix called Our Planet and the Jungles episode, and you're interested in seeing a little bit more about this actual individual bird here and some of the work Tim and I did, you can watch that. That is some of the camera work that we were doing for that series at the time when we were doing this work. So the discoveries on the female perspective, though, weren't just going to be limited to the Perodias. That's where we started. That was kind of what we did next, because we knew that species and how to set it up. And we did that with the Western Perodia for that work, including the Our Planet series. But we knew there were a handful of other species that we had documented traditionally from the ground that we thought, oh, well, the female perches above the male and looks down. And even though we thought we knew what was going on, we were thinking, oh, well, we better look into this. We were surprised with the Perodia. Let's see what's going on in some of these other species. And so our next candidate for that work took us out of the Arfak Mountains and into the islands west of the Bird's Head in the Raja Ampat. This is Waigeo Island, and we are there for a species that's found only in this and a nearby island called Wilson's bird of paradise. And kind of like the Perodias, they also display on the ground. They clear a terrestrial court. But unlike the Perodias, they don't dance around on the ground. They actually do all their courtship displays from a small sapling, and they do kind of their dances to the female on this little vertical sapling near the ground, and the female lands above him on the same sapling and looks down. So this really opened up an opportunity for us to do something similar and try to get an idea of what the behavior of this species looked like, which we had seen and documented many times before, but from this female's perspective. So here's kind of the traditional blind view You see the male there. He's onto his main display perch there. And a female just landed above him. She's looking down. Well, if we have our cameras above looking over the female, what do we see? He's moving his head back and forth. Now he's going to flash his mouth at her. And now he's going to transform himself into his main courtship display here. And boom, the amount of iridescent colors that are revealed when you're looking down from above is completely different than what you see from the side. So he's looking up at her and his breast feathers are flat and it just looks kind of black. And then when he lifts them up and pulls them around, it's catching the light from above and you get this just kind of like plate-like, highly iridescent green. When we're looking at that view from the side, in the traditional photography, we don't see that iridescent green at all. It just, it looks kind of blue at best. Of course, we know that there's iridescent green on the breast because, he moves around in other perspectives. So we've seen it there and seen it in specimens and things, but nothing like this at all. And then there's little details that, had been completely unnoticed, even from looking at specimens. Like if you look closely at your screen, you'll see there's kind of like a little necklace of blue iridescent feathers that go just under the throat there. And then the way that the curlicue tail feathers sort of line up with the top of the green breast feathers from the female's perspective, and the kind of blue of the tail, the blue of the head, and the blue of the legs. It just makes this really amazing complete package that we hadn't really seen before. So again, like the other one, if you want to see more of this species and some of the work we did on this, you might check out the work we did with the BBC for our Planet Earth 2 series. Tim and I did the work on this species for that. Not this individual bird here. This was the subsequent year, but the year before we did that. So you can learn a little bit more about that behavior and see that there online somewhere if you haven't seen it already. All right, so that was pretty cool, and kind of was another moment of like, wow, okay, yeah, this whole female perspective thing, there's a lot to it. We're going to have to take this even further. And so the next candidate for us, kind of like we did going from one Parodia to the next, was to visit a close relative of Wilson's, and that took us back up into the Arfak Mountains nearby, not far from where we had worked on the Western Parodia and the Vogelkopf Superb, just down a little bit lower elevation. And kind of went into this cloud forest environment again. And this is the home of another ground displaying bird of paradise, the magnificent bird of paradise, which if you look at this, you'll see some similarities to its close relative, Wilson's. The shape of the tail feather is similar, although different in structure on magnificent bird of paradise. They're longer and more wiry. They're more dense and thicker in Wilson's, and have a tighter, smaller coil. Similar color pattern on their backs. No blue head on the magnificent bird of paradise. These are really widespread, fairly common birds of paradise. We had, worked on them at many locations all throughout New Guinea over the years, and we kind of thought, oh, we'd seen everything there is to see about them. But after all these other revelations, we decided, well, okay, we got to pull out our bag of tricks and try it again, and see if we can make some observations and any new discoveries on magnificent bird of paradise. So as a close relative of Wilson's, you can imagine it also has a similar place where it displays, clears out a court on the forest floor, as you can see here, and also displays on an upright sapling, doesn't dance on the ground. The female lands on that from above and looks down at the male. And from the side view, the traditional, view that we've seen from the photography blinds in the past, it always looks a lot like this, which is pretty spectacular. You can see his breast shield is lifted out there. Doesn't look nearly as bright green as the Wilson's does, at least from the side. And he lifts up his feathers almost like the superb bird of paradise does, but these yellow feathers of his nape lift up around his head and kind of form this interesting structure, which we figured that's going to look pretty interesting from above. So got the cameras up looking over the shoulder of the female, and here's the male. He's on the kind of the perch waiting for the female to arrive. He's pulsing those breast feathers. And here is the view from approximately to the female, perspective looking down now. And you can see this, completely different intensity to the iridescent feathers. You can see these sort of bib-like blue feathers running down the front, and that just incredible intensity to that yellow halo behind his head. So, again, we knew kind of what it was going to look like, but at the same time, we really weren't prepared for just how spectacular it really looks when you get your cameras, you get your eyes lined up in the proper perspective between where the male's ornaments are and where the light's coming down in the way that these ornaments were meant to be seen from the female perspective. So the main point here is that even in a common widespread bird of paradise, like magnificent bird of paradise, there were plenty surprises in store for us. And this just kind of goes to reinforce just there's so much more to be discovered and learned about these fantastic birds. We've only done this kind of work with a handful of species now, and there's just like peeling away layers of the onion. There's so many interesting scientific questions, so many fantastic things to see. And the forests of New Guinea are just full of these kinds of discoveries waiting out there. And we are hoping that the birds of paradise and the forest of New Guinea will continue to be there well into the future for some of this stuff to be figured out and for more discoveries to be made. I do want to point out that there's a little pattern here. If you want to see more footage of this particular species, just like the others, we were doing this work for another series, and actually we did this independently, but ended up being in a series called Attenborough's Life in Color. So if you look that up, you can see some more of our work on the magnificent bird of paradise here. All right, so this brings me to kind of a shift a little bit in the second question I posed at the beginning that we often get asked, but a little bit of shift in our work and our focus and our priority. And that really comes back to the forests of New Guinea and the homelands of the birds of paradise and their habitats. And basically the threats facing these forests and the long-term opportunity for people like you folks who dream or interested in going to New Guinea as birders, or for people in the future to be able to have a chance to see most of them. Fortunately, most birds of paradise aren't critically endangered or anything like that. There's still lots of forest left in New Guinea. But things are changing, just like they're changing all around the world. It's not just New Guinea, but the threats to these forests are becoming stronger and more acute for lots of reasons. And I'll talk about a few of them. But we felt like our work doing the photography and the science and the expeditions making discoveries on birds of paradise could practically go on for the rest of our careers. There was so much to be done. But because we were feeling more alarmed, and because we felt like we had done so much work to bring these birds to the world and share them with people, we felt like it was really our obligation to make sure we were doing as much as we could to help ensure that the forest that they call home and lots of other biodiversity and people call home would have the better chance of being protected and being around in the future. And so, like I mentioned a bit ago, the good news is there's still a lot of forest in New Guinea. When you travel around the island of New Guinea, there's not a lot of roads. You end up having to go everywhere by airplane and small aircraft. And one of the things you notice right away is you're looking out the window and you can just see forest stretching to the horizon. That's very heartwarming for a field biologist or an ornithologist or a conservationist to fly over a tropical forest region and see so much forest. So that's the good news. There's still a lot there. And that's the opportunity, right, is to keep it that way to the extent that we can. So New Guinea, going back to some kind of map things here, right? New Guinea, which, like I said, is home to nearly all the bird of paradise or most of the bird of paradise species, is a major part of the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific or Southeast Asian, whatever you want to call it, rainforest system, right? This is one of the three main tropical forest systems in the world. The other one's in Central Africa, like the Congo Basin, and of course the Amazon, right? But this is this big forested area. And not that long ago, like 20 years ago, there was still a considerable amount of forest throughout this whole region. That's what you're looking at in this map here, the main forested areas. But over the last 20 years, there has been an incredible amount of forest loss throughout this rainforest. So what you're looking at here is basically a heat map, if you will, that is a cumulative mapping of forest loss throughout the Indo-Pacific forests between the year 2001 and 2019. And if you look at kind of the areas in the mainland Southeast Asia, all throughout Western Indonesia, like the islands of Sumatra and Borneo in particular, these massively forested islands have lost an incredible amount. And the areas that you see on this map that are more black, like the island of New Guinea, are areas that have lost less forest over that period of time, or in the case of Java, didn't have any forests to begin with to be lost in that time. Most of it was already gone before 2001. So, oh yeah, I forgot I put these in. Anyway, the main forested areas are the black ones. I'll just re-say that again. And if you see, there's kind of three places that have most of the forests left. That's in the northern part of Sumatra, just a tiny little bit there. The heart of Borneo. So much has been lost all around Borneo, largely for oil palm plantations and other industrial agriculture. And then by far the most is in New Guinea. So this is kind of a mix of those two maps. So, in the bright green is showing areas that still have primary or intact forests, and the forest loss more or less over the last 20 years. But the important thing here, like I said, is that New Guinea is still very forested. About 80% of its forest cover is there. And this represents more than half of all of the rainforest left in this entire forest system. So, when you're talking about the rainforest of Southeast Asia, more than 50% of it is in New Guinea. So this is why you see, the importance of New Guinea, homeland of the birds of paradise, and so many spectacular things. So protecting these forests, right, is not only critical for species like birds of paradise, but in many ways it's critical for all of us and for the entire planet Earth, because of the important services these forests provide, just like they do in the Congo or Amazon in terms of carbon sequestration and all the ecosystem services that intact forests provide: clean water, air, fire suppression, all kinds of things. But we are, even though I said you can fly forever and not see too many roads, we are literally seeing changes coming on the ground. In New Guinea, in Indonesia, in both sides, in Papua New Guinea. So in New Guinea, the island is divided in half between two different countries: Papua New Guinea in the east and Indonesian New Guinea on the west. This is in Indonesian New Guinea here. And here's a road that's being built through the highest pass in all of Indonesian, New Guinea. It crosses a divide at over 3,700 meters, so at nearly 12,000 feet. It's a kind of a road that's just connecting towns and villages in the highland valleys to the coasts in the south. It's not highly traveled, but it cuts through some really sensitive ecological, almost like above tree level alpine environments that used to be glaciated, like you can see from these rock outcroppings here. And even passes through a national park that's not really protected, but is on paper, which also happens to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But again, it was completely encroached by this road, and it really has very little protection other than the fact of its remoteness. So these roads are increasingly cutting through forests, which, there's benefits to the local communities. Of course, that can be denied, but it also provides access for increased logging, increase in access for industrial agriculture, especially things like massive plantations for the production of oil palm. So more and more lowland forests across New Guinea are being completely converted into oil palm plantations. And highland forests in New Guinea are slowly being logged on a very different scale than industrial logging for the most part, but they're becoming more and more vulnerable as these roads go through. So if you look at the western half of New Guinea, the Indonesian half here. Um, we can see these from, basically Indonesian government records, all the different parts of Western New Guinea that have been essentially, leased out concessions for some type of resource extraction, mostly logging and for industrial agriculture like oil palm or pulpwood, and then some mining. So huge amounts of this forest is under real potential threat. Not all of it's been converted yet or turned into this. It hasn't been realized yet, but the potential is there on paper for that much of it to be lost. And so, our goal over the last few years and through work I'm doing at the Lab of Ornithology, through the conservation media, the Center for Conservation Media at the Lab of Ornithology, is really trying to figure out how to keep these forest ecosystems intact. What can we do to get people who are, like yourselves and like all the people around the world who've gotten excited about birds of paradise from seeing them from our work or from watching the nature documentaries, get them more invested in and figuring out what can be done to support the governments of Indonesia, New Guinea, or Indonesia in their efforts to change those logging concessions and protect these forests, return them back to the indigenous landowners, and let them be the stewards of it, like they have for 40,000 years in some cases. But this is a very out of the way place that a lot of people don't know much about, and requires a lot of funding and support and international support. And so right now our job is to kind of just get the word out about what the opportunity is, and try to work with these governments and NGOs working in the region, and bring the media and resources that we have from our work with Birds of Paradise, but also at the Lab of Ornithology, and use the Birds of Paradise as basically these ambassadors, if you will, these iconic symbols of the New Guinea forests. And that's been the focus of our work for the last few years, and it's really the direction that we're focused on for the next, probably 5 years moving forward. It's not that we won't continue to do the great documentary work of the behavior and the kind of things that we shared at the beginning here, but it's really our future work to kind of make a difference and give back and keep these New Guinea forests intact for the birds, for the people, and really for the health of all of us because of how valuable these forests are. So I'm going to leave it there for tonight, and be happy to answer questions about anything, behavior, and all the fun stuff, the photography, the birding opportunities, and certainly more about the conservation and stuff, whatever you guys are interested in.
Well, thank you, Ed. That was fantastic. I have a couple questions while we allow people a little bit of time to put their questions in chat. But I was really impressed with the sort of super black, the Vanta black of these birds, and the contrast with the iridescence. And I was just wondering, the forest floor seems like a pretty shadowy place, and was it difficult at all to get the lighting on them, or do they just naturally go to areas where there are streams of light coming in to illuminate the iridescent feathers?
Yeah, so that's a really great observation, and there's a lot there and several different layers to unpack. So with the species that display on the floor in the cloud forest, as you can imagine, being in cloud forest, it's pretty dark. Even in the middle of the day in the montane cloud forest, you don't see a lot of direct sunlight. It's almost always overcast. Sun comes out for brief windows and then goes away. And species like the Western Perodia and the superb bird of paradise, they're down in this low light environment. And in both cases, though, more so in the Perodia than the superb, the males are actually modifying their environment around their display areas, removing leaves, clearing the court. The superb is also removing leaves around the log. So they are opening up an area that's going to let what little bit of light that is available to come through. And they do this in a column all the way up through the canopy. So they're removing, especially in the Perodias, leaves all the way up, so that there's basically a little bit of a gap coming through the canopy down to their display site. and they never seem to. We don't have great data on this, but the anecdotal observational data pretty much is indicative of what's going on because we're spending so many hours there for the observation photography work. If it's sunny and the sun is shining down more directly on the court and there's lots of like harsh shadows and things, they don't display. They actually have evolved with those bright iridescent feathers and that vantablack, like you said, to be able to make use of the cloudy diffuse sky. So there's this nice diffuse light coming down through the forest, and the black absorbs every last photon, almost literally, and then the iridescence is kind of the opposite. It's like a mirror reflecting everything back out. And it's very, very directional, as you saw. So if you get those feathers lined up just right with that available light, you really can see a lot of color. Layer that on top of that super black, and it's contrasty and brilliant. But years ago, it's still dark enough. It wouldn't have been possible without more sensitive camera and photographic equipment like we have now. That's made a big difference.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. So knowing that the males have spent so much time preparing that display area, once you discover a display area like that, you're probably pretty well set for your shoot. It's just a matter of waiting for the bird. But it seems like it'd be very likely to come back to that very same tree time and time again. Is that correct?
That's right. So the males are very invested and have a lot of site fidelity. It's a little bit different in different species of birds of paradise. Some species, might have one or two perches or vines or branches throughout their territory that they use, and finding the one that's the preferred one or where the females are going to come, because that's when you're going to see most displays might vary. But for something like the Parodia, when you find that clearing on the ground, or the magnificent bird of paradise or the Wilsons, they've invested so much time to clear that patch. That's the only place where they're doing their displays. So once you find that, you set it up, you're going to minimally see the male visit and do maintenance and do practice displays. The real challenge there is are females going to come? So the way it works in birds of paradise and the way the mating system works and the strong sexual selection is that most females will visit all the males in their territorial home range. But really, in the end, only one or two males in kind of like a human dimension are going to be the ones that see multiple females on a regular basis. And so if you don't find that one male, you're not going to see a lot of action. So we've spent a lot of time, kind of just staring at these display sites, and the males come around, but they're not doing much. And you got to find the ones that the females are more interested in, unless you just happen to hit it right at like the best time of the breeding season when there's just so many females around. They are visiting them all, but getting that window is pretty hard to do.
Yeah, I have one more question I want to ask before we go into the chat, and that is your observation about the female's perspective was really incredible, because I think we haven't done that very much. Imagine what it looks like from the female's perspective, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about other families, particularly passerines, where that might be the case, where that observation from the female's perspective might shine some light on subspecies or kind of cryptic species that we might have not noticed before?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost certainly the case. I think, they wouldn't, the ones that come to mind for me are ones that are probably not that surprising. And in some cases, I think what we see as observers of those species is not that different than what the females see, and so there may not be that much more to discover in the way that we have with birds of paradise. And I'm thinking of things like grouse on a lek.
Mm-hmm.
Where they're moving all around the lek, so no matter where you kind of sit, you could very well be lined up with the way the female is going to be, and you're probably going to see the sage grouse display. So looking for areas where there's sort of a three-dimensional aspect to the signaling, and realizing that as humans on the ground, we might not be taking advantage of that whole three-dimensional, or in other modalities, sound, acoustic components of it, and so on, where there's directional elements to that. So I think with hummingbirds is a really good example of where, we might see a male doing a display, zipping around to a female, but we're looking at it from the side. And yet, the light source is going to be coming from the sun through the forest canopy, and where that male is going to be moving around the female to highlight his often iridescent ornaments and feathers. There could very well be things there that we haven't seen fully from the female perspective. Then again, they're hummingbirds and they're not as tied to one specific display site, and they're moving all around. So, most likely, a lot of them have been seen. But I wouldn't say that there's not plenty to be learned there. Things like mannequins and
Yeah,
cotillas.
I was just gonna say maybe mannequins might be a place for that kind of study, but it
Yeah.
seems like you've pretty much identified the location for that kind of research would be the birds of paradise. It
Yeah.
opens up so many levels of complexity that we couldn't have known before.
Yeah, I mean, they really are using the iridescent, sort of like the shape shifting, where they're doing things to modify the look of their body, which has a different look depending on the way you're looking at them. Different shape, a modification of the body form, and then the iridescence. Where things like mannequins don't really utilize iridescence, and iridescence is inherently directional. So that really lends itself to this kind of perspective work. So you want to be looking for things, where you have that kind of directional component to the communication going on, and then try to put our brains and our observation tools in line with what the organisms are doing.
Yeah, well, that was a brilliant decision on your part. But it looks like we do have several comments and questions. So maybe Carolyn would like to give us a few.
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna start you off, Ed, with I think the simplest one. Were you the one to take the picture of Tim that we started out with when he was perched in that tree?
No, Tim is a master of taking pictures of all kinds of things remotely, including himself.
It was a selfie.
It was a selfie. Camera up in the tree a little higher. Yeah.
All right. Our next question: what are the locals thinking about what's currently happening with regards to the development?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it depends on where you are in New Guinea. The story is different in Papua New Guinea than in Indonesian New Guinea in some ways. So by and large, the story that I hear and the stories that I hear about from locals is that they feel like a lot of the development is not benefiting them, right? And it's not an unfamiliar story in the developing world anywhere, right? But the roads are coming in, and they're happy about the roads. It allows them to get access to towns instead of having to walk for days, and take their things to market and buy things, and education, healthcare, all that. There's no doubt that they appreciate that, just like we do. Allows birders to go there, right? Tourism opportunities. But a lot of these roads are being built so that trucks can come and clear the forest for these industrial plantations like oil palm or pulpwood, and they have the right to do that legally in Indonesia from those concessions that are granted by the government. They don't really honor the traditional land ownership of the indigenous people. It's not that the indigenous people don't get some kind of payment or compensation. They do, but it's pretty minimal. And then in the end, they end up being excluded from their homelands, the forests that they depended on for building materials and food and all kinds of things, and find themselves worse off in the long run than they were before, without much money and without too many more resources. So there's a lot at that kind of that on the ground level, a lot of discontent with a lot of that kind of development. In Indonesian New Guinea, over the last few years, there's been some effort by the governments of the two provinces, West Papua and Papua Province, but more successfully so in West Papua Province, to try to break that cycle. And they wanted to make themselves into more of a sustainable development province and try to find ways of developing that aren't so detrimental to the environment of the Papuan people, and look for things like ecotourism or other kind of more green economic things to get the kind of growth and development that they want, but without the big cost for the forests. And they've looked externally, globally, also saying, hey, we've got these carbon sequestering forests. And we know people want to pay for them for offsetting the forests that they don't have and the fossil fuels that they're burning that we're not. And so they're looking for, basically some of these carbon schemes to provide income for them to protect the forest. So there's a lot of opportunity there, support from the ground, the community level, all the way up through the provincial government level, and a little bit more so now also the national government level in Indonesia. The last few years have been the lowest rates of deforestation, forest loss in Indonesia since the beginning of record keeping. So that's a good sign and some moves in the right direction.
All right, great, thank you. Are there any specific groups within New Guinea that are trying to work on solutions to restore restore the forest?
So restore the already degraded forest?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are. It's some, in Indonesia, in particular, more than in Papua New Guinea, just because Indonesia as a nation is facing so much more opportunity for restoring degraded forests in places like Borneo and Sumatra. It's not that those areas that I showed where there's been forest loss over the last 20 years are completely devoid of forests. They're not. You go there and you look, you see trees in a lot of those places. They just they're degraded forests, and not all of them have been permanently converted. Some of them have just been logged and then allowed to regrow. So there's a lot of opportunity to restore that there. And because of that infrastructure and that knowledge base is in place, and that there is value in forest restoration, there are local NGOs and other things that are working towards that in places in New Guinea and Indonesian New Guinea as well. I'm not seeing it on like whole oil palm plantations being restored or anything like that scale yet in New Guinea, but maybe someday. But that's a whole nother level of restoration.
Thank you. Swinging it back to the birds, what do the feathers look like under UV light? Are you seeing different patterns than are visible otherwise?
Yeah. So there hasn't been a great systematic survey of bird of paradise feathers under UV measurements, and part of this is because there's so many different diverse patches. To do it well, you got to kind of look at all different parts of the bird. It's not just like they're one color. So the short story is, to the extent that it's been looked at, there are a handful of kind of interesting things that have a UV component that was kind of hidden. And two examples from tonight's species that I could talk about is, one is not feathers. So actually it's the blue skin on the head of Wilson's actually has a UV component. And that yellow collar around the magnificent bird of paradise actually has some UV fluorescence. So that would look like a super yellow, essentially, if you can see in the UV. But it's kind of the more of the classic UV, the things that are, in the sort of super blue or green that have hidden patterns and things like we've seen from, some other groups of birds where there's like a hidden plumage patch, essentially, haven't been found in birds of paradise. Their plumage patches tend to be these iridescent ones that are kind of, they don't need to be hidden. they're intentionally contrasty and directional. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some more discoveries to be found there. I think there are. I think insides of the mouth is another place to be looking. And I think we've fairly recently have had some evidence of some kind of more classic UV signaling happening on one side of the feather of the King of Saxony birds of paradise. Has these long antenna-like feather that he waves around off its head. One side is brown and the other side is kind of this light blue color, and that seems to be in UV there. So that's certainly a UV ornament. So there's going to be more found, I'm sure.
All right, thank you. With the clearing element of their kind of preparation to allow light down, are they sort of acting as a small scale ecosystem engineer?
Yeah, they are. And the really interesting question there on how small scale it really is in the long run. So birds of paradise are largely fruit eating. The males depend on having fruiting trees nearby their display sites so that they can kind of zip off, eat a bunch of fruit fast, ripe fruit, and come back. And the logical consequence of that is that they're spending a lot of time on say this one patch of ground or this one log, if in the case of the superb bird of paradise. And what are they doing? We see it all the time. They're pooping and they're regurgitating seeds. So many times, I've kind of confirmed the activity level of a Parodia court or even a log for a potential superb bird of paradise by getting down and looking for what looks like freshly regurgitated seeds. And so certainly over time, there's going to be a non-random dispersal of those fruit trees around those display sites. So there is an interesting kind of ecological engineer thing going on with seed dispersal. And a lot of these fruit trees have co-evolved with fruit-eating, New Guinea birds. There's not these are mostly bird-dispersed fruits, and birds of paradise play a big role in that.
All right. So we've got another question. Like other lekking species, do females take on most of the nesting and chick rearing duties?
They do. They take on all of it for the species that we know. So, males play no role in parental care for any bird of paradise that we know of. And females usually only rear one chick a year, but in some cases two. And they're also very long lived. So females could be doing that for 20 plus years in the wild. We don't have a lot of good data on that, but in captivity, birds of paradise have actually lived more than 30 years, and a handful of banded birds have been captured in the wild that are around 20 years old. Not a lot of opportunity. There's not that much banding, but we have some insight on that. So, but back to the other question, no parental care by the males.
Yeah, I was going to say the banding process for those birds has to be crazy complicated considering the habitat you're in. So can you comment on what species have been lost in the regions where the forest has been either destroyed or degraded? Or has there been kind of an insufficient study to really know?
Mostly it's the latter. And a lot of the lowland, so most, like I said, most of the largest scale forest loss or degradation has happened in the lowlands. And the lowland forests and the lowland species of birds of paradise also tend to be the most widespread. So, they could be locally removed, right? When the forest is disturbed, they don't have their fruit trees available. They don't like the disturbance of people and display sites. So they're not there. But fortunately, in the patches of forest that remain, through, say, the lowlands of southern New Guinea, even where some of these big oil palm plantations and things are, those species aren't going extinct. The most vulnerable bird of paradise species are actually the island endemics, like the Wilson's bird of paradise and another species that lives on that island with it, red bird of paradise, because they're limited to just those islands, and they don't have huge population sizes to begin with on those islands, even before there was any human disturbance, because it's a mix of elevation and what's the right forest zone, and also those islands have really strange soils and rocky outcroppings. So even though, like, from above it looks like it's all forest, a lot of those forests aren't of the right type to support the birds of paradise. So they're kind of spotty in distribution, around. So those end up being much more vulnerable to disturbance. Fortunately, those islands, Waigeo is still, has lots of forest too, and has some protected status. So they probably be okay. But there are roads and airstrips and towns growing around the coast. And then there's the Sky Islands, similar story, but it's the species like, say, the Western Parodia or the Vogelkop superb bird of paradise that are kind of found just in these fairly small mountain ranges on the mainland, like the Arfak Mountains or Tamaraw Mountains of the Bird's Head Peninsula, and in this narrow elevational band. And so that for species that co-occur in places where humans like to live and build roads and deforest it, that can be a lot of disruption. But most of those are not close to becoming extinct yet. And so that's the real opportunity. That's what I like to say. Like, who wants to really be the conservationist that has to be like, trying to save the species that's on the brink of extinction, like pandas or something? No, that you want to be the conservationist that basically has the opportunity to protect the landscapes and the habitat before the species are lost. And that's the opportunity that we have in New Guinea. We can get it right this time and try to, keep it intact. And that's what the people that live there also want. And so we can really do something that, hasn't happened very easily in other parts of the world.
All right. Great. So regarding palm oil, can you characterize where most of it goes? What industries is it going to?
Pretty much everything. I guarantee you, everybody on this call right now could probably, even in the room you're in, if not in your kitchen or bathroom, find products with palm oil in it, even if you're very vigilant and try and know that palm oil is bad, for the rainforest, and try not to buy it. It is basically impossible because it is derivatives of palm oil go by all kinds of names that are completely unrecognizable as having anything to do with palm oil on an ingredients list. And it is in industrial products, soap, cleaning materials, makeup, in all kinds of food. So yes, we look at our packaging and see, oh, this has palm oil in my Nutella or whatever. And, maybe you won't buy that next time, but it's actually much more insidious than that. So it is all over. And I know people who, really, really try to avoid it, and they can't. It's just impossible right now. And, the supply chain of it is not very transparent. And so even when people are trying to do the right thing and buy sustainably sourced, and I'm talking about companies, trying to buy sustainably sourced palm oil for their products, the certification process is very non-transparent and largely corrupt on the ground in places like New Guinea. And so companies, even with good intent, are buying palm oil that is coming from primary disturbed forest and primary logged forest places like Indonesia and New Guinea. That is a major problem.
All right. Well, unfortunately, on that note, we do have to close out the evening. Thank you so much for sticking around for our questions and for sharing all these fantastic birds with us, Ed.
Yeah, no problem.
I'd like to thank you also, and everybody who showed up this evening. I got one more little comment. The presentation was wonderful, and it so inspires me to want to go. I'm a little afraid of arduous hikes through the rainforest with leeches, but I think I might be able to do it, knowing that I might be able to see some of these birds. But it was truly wonderful, and your observations about the mating displays and the female perspective, and also the ecology and the conservation it's just wonderful. So thank you so much. And I look forward to picking up a copy of your book. It was wonderful. So yeah, so thank you so much for being here tonight. And I wanted to remind everybody once again that we are in the middle of our birdathon, so feel free to hop onto our website and find a way that you can join or sponsor a team. And also remind you that next month on the 20th, we'll be having Holly Merker, the author of Ornithology, will be speaking on April 20th. So we have that to look forward to. But for this evening, it was all about Ed and his fabulous project, the Bird of Paradise project. Thank you so much for being here. We release you to go to bed now, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night, everybody.